In the gilded but somber halls of Clarence House, a silence so heavy it felt suffocating was suddenly pierced by the shrill, persistent ring of a private phone. It wasn't the usual encrypted line for diplomatic briefings or the scheduled check-ins from palace aides. This was the frequency reserved for family, a line that had remained hauntingly quiet for months. When King Charles III, a man whose life has been a masterclass in stoicism and duty, finally reached for the device, he could not have known that the next 3 minutes would dismantle the fragile peace he had fought so hard to maintain. On the other end was Prince Harry. But this wasn't a call for reconciliation, nor was it a desperate plea for a return to the royal fold. Instead, it was a cold, calculated delivery of what palace insiders are now calling Meghan's final ban. As the conversation unfolded, seasoned officials standing guard outside the study door reported a sound they thought they would never hear: the unmistakable, guttural sob of a king. Charles, a monarch who has weathered the storms of divorce, public scandal, and the weight of a 1,000-year-old institution, was reduced to a father in mourning. The final ban wasn't just about titles or security. It was a definitive declaration that Meghan Markle would never again set foot on British soil. And more devastatingly, that the king's grandchildren, Archie and Lilibet, were being permanently severed from their ancestral heritage. The room seemed to shrink as the king's face, usually set in a mask of regal indifference, drained of all color. A long-serving aide, who had stood by Charles through the darkest days following the Queen's funeral, described the scene as soul-crushing. The king wasn't just crying for the loss of a son. He was weeping for the end of an era, the realization that the Windsor dream of a united family was officially dead. Harry's tone was reportedly devoid of emotion, a sharp contrast to the king's visible distress. He spoke with a clarity that landed like a blade through silk. Meghan's ultimatum was clear. The bridge was not just burned, it had been erased from the map. The palace, which had spent years spinning a narrative of hopeful reunion, was suddenly staring into a void of total estrangement. As the call ended and the line went dead, the silence that followed was even more terrifying than the words themselves. The king sat motionless, the phone still clutched in a trembling hand, as the realization set in that his grandchildren would grow up as strangers to the crown he wore. What exactly were the terms of Meghan's ban that could break a king so completely? And why did Harry choose this specific moment to deliver the final blow? As the echoes of the dial tone faded in the king's private study, the air seemed to thicken with the scent of old parchment and the cold, metallic taste of a constitutional crisis. King Charles didn't just hear words on that call. He felt the structural integrity of the House of Windsor begin to crumble under the weight of what is now being whispered as the Montecito Protocol. This wasn't a rambling vent or a plea for more money. It was a legally vetted, surgically precise ultimatum delivered with a finality that made the king's previous battles with the press look like child's play. The final ban was not merely a refusal to visit. It was a comprehensive erasure of the Sussex's royal footprint. Meghan's terms, delivered through Harry's voice, included a chilling clause. Archie and Lilibet are to be raised with no formal knowledge of their royal destiny. To a king whose entire existence is defined by lineage and the preservation of the crown, this was an act of emotional regicide. He was being told that the bloodline he carries would be treated as a toxic legacy to be avoided at all costs. The grandchildren he longed to mentor, the toddlers he hoped would one day walk the gardens of Highgrove, were being placed behind an invisible, impenetrable wall of silence. But the blow that truly broke the king's spirit was the mention of the Global Silence Agreement. Harry reportedly informed his father that any attempt by the palace to use the children's images or titles for rebranding the monarchy would trigger an immediate, irreversible release of private journals' diaries kept by Meghan during her time behind palace walls. It was a stalemate of the highest order. The king was being held to ransom, not for gold, but for the very memories and future of his family. Clarence House officials, usually the masters of damage control, found themselves in uncharted territory. One senior advisor, known for his ice-cold nerves, was seen pacing the corridor, his face a mask of disbelief. The king had reportedly ordered all staff to leave the room, but the sound of his weeping could be heard through the heavy oak doors, a sound described as the mourning of a father who has just realized his son is truly gone. This wasn't just about a family feud, it was about the survival of the narrative. If the king cannot even unite his own household, how can he lead a nation? The final ban also included a devastating demand regarding the king's own health. Meghan allegedly insisted that any public updates on Charles's medical condition must not include her children's names to protect them from the royal machine's exploitation. The cruelty was calculated. At a time when Charles is facing his own mortality, he is being denied the one thing that gives a man peace, the continuity of his kin. As the dusk settled over London, the king called an emergency meeting, but not with his ministers. He called for the one person who has always seen through the palace spin. Princess Anne arrived under the cover of darkness, her expression grim. The battle lines were no longer between the UK and the US. They were drawn through the very heart of the king's soul. The question remained, what was the palace hiding that made Meghan's threat so powerful? And what was Charles prepared to sacrifice to see his grandchildren one last time? The heavy, iron-studded doors of Clarence House groaned as they swung open to admit the one person in the United Kingdom who could look a king in the eye and tell him the unvarnished, brutal truth. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, arrived not with the fanfare of a royal visit, but with the quiet, lethal efficiency of a commander entering a war room. She found her brother, King Charles, seated not at his grand desk, but in a small armchair by the dying embers of the fireplace, clutching a series of transcribed notes from the phone call that had just shattered his world. The room was thick with the scent of old wood and the crushing weight of a legacy that was being methodically dismantled from 6,000 miles away. Anne did not offer platitudes. She did not offer a shoulder to cry on. Instead, she walked directly to the decanter, poured 2 fingers of scotch, and handed it to the king. "We always knew she was a strategist, Charles," she reportedly whispered, her voice like flint striking steel. "But we didn't think she would weaponize the children's very identities against us." The conversation that followed, according to a silent aide stationed just outside the perimeter, was a clinical autopsy of the Montecito Protocol. Anne's reaction to Meghan's final ban was not one of sadness, but of cold, calculated fury. To Anne, the crown is a sacred trust, and for Meghan to treat the royal bloodline of Archie and Lilibet as something toxic to be purged was, in her eyes, the ultimate act of treason. But the atmosphere shifted from tense to terrifying when Charles gestured toward a leather-bound folder that had been retrieved from the Windsor vault, the palace's most secure archive of private correspondence. This wasn't just any file, it was the S-file, a collection of internal reports from the early days of the Sussex marriage. Charles revealed to his sister the terrifying leverage Meghan actually held. The journals Meghan threatened to release weren't just about hurt feelings or palace gossip. They allegedly contained contemporary notes on conversations involving the late Queen Elizabeth II and the transition of power. The king's tears had dried, replaced by a hollow, haunting realization. The final ban was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. By banning the children from the UK, Meghan wasn't just protecting them. She was creating a vacuum of legacy. If the public cannot see the children, they cannot love them. And if they cannot love them, the future of the monarchy becomes a theoretical concept rather than a living, breathing reality. Anne's advice was characteristic of her the firm mentality. If they wish to be ghosts, Charles, we must treat them as such, but we do not negotiate with those who hold our history hostage. Yet, the king's heart remained a father's heart. He showed Anne the most devastating part of Harry's message, a handwritten note Harry had scanned and sent immediately after the call. It was a drawing, allegedly by young Archie, of a house with no crown on top. The message was clear. They were building a world where the King of England did not exist. The psychological toll on Charles was visible. His hands shook as he replaced the paper in the folder. He was being asked to choose between being a king who protects the institution and a grandfather who begs for a scrap of connection. As the clocks in Clarence House chimed midnight, A decision was made. The palace would not issue a standard recollection may vary statement. This time, the response would be silent, but the machinery of the state was beginning to turn. Charles authorized the review of the 1,917 letters patent, the very rules that govern titles. If Meghan wanted a final ban on the children's royal exposure, the king was considering making that ban official in a way that would strip the Sussex name of its last remaining power. The War of the Windsors had entered its most lethal phase, and the casualties were no longer just reputations, they were the children themselves. As dawn broke over the grey spires of London on this cold January morning in 2026, the quiet hum of the royal legal machinery began to vibrate through the walls of Buckingham Palace. King Charles, fueled by the steely resolve of Princess Anne, had authorized a move that many considered the nuclear option. In a hidden office within the Lord Chamberlain's department, a team of constitutional lawyers began the grim task of drafting a modern amendment to the 1,917 letters patent. The objective was clear: a formal mechanism to place royal titles into abeyance for those living permanently outside the Commonwealth who actively work against the interests of the Crown. This wasn't just a snub, it was a legal excommunication. Charles was preparing to strip the Sussex brand of its last vestige of royal authority, effectively turning Archie and Lilibet into private citizens before they were old enough to understand their birthright. However, the palace had underestimated the speed of the Montecito counterintelligence. Before the ink was even dry on the first draft of the legal brief, the first tremor of a scorched earth rebuttal hit the digital airwaves. Meghan Markle's camp didn't wait for the palace to strike first. A controlled leak appeared in a major U.S. publication, detailing a series of unanswered pleas for security and mental health support for the children over the last 2 years. The narrative was being flipped in real time. Charles wasn't a grieving grandfather. He was being painted as a distant, institutional patriarch, more concerned with dusty laws than the safety of his own flesh and blood. The psychological warfare intensified when Meghan's high-powered U.S. legal team, men and women who operate in the shadows of Hollywood's elite, issued a cryptic no comment that carried the weight of 1,000 threats. They didn't need to speak. The mere mention of the Sussex journals in the tabloid press was enough to send the palace into a tailspin. Insiders whisper that these journals contain not just Meghan's reflections, but actual recorded transcripts of private family summits held at Sandringham. If Charles moved to strip titles, Meghan was prepared to release the raw data of the monarchy, the unedited, unvarnished conversations that would show the world exactly how the firm operates when the cameras are off. The atmosphere at Clarence House turned from ut melancholy to pure panic. The king was reportedly seen pacing the long gallery, the weight of the crown visible in the slump of his shoulders. He was caught in a lethal pincer move. Move forward with the legal strike and risk the total exposure of the monarchy's secrets, or retreat and allow Meghan's final ban to stand, effectively losing his grandchildren forever. The final ban was no longer just a family dispute. It was a high-stakes chess match where every move led to a potential checkmate for the British monarchy. Just as the legal teams prepared for a formal exchange of letters of intent, a mysterious digital package arrived at the palace's press office. It wasn't a legal document. It was a video file, encrypted and timed. The message attached was simple: "Do not mistake my silence for weakness. The truth has a way of coming out." The sender was anonymous, but the timing was too perfect to be anyone but the Sussex camp. Charles was being forced to look into the abyss, and for the first time in his reign, he realized that the crown might not be the most powerful force in this fight. The silence in the palace's cybersecurity suite was clinical, broken only by the hum of high-end servers and the frantic clicking of a technician's keyboard. King Charles stood behind the monitors, his breath hitching as the mysterious video file from the Sussex camp finally decrypted. He had expected a legal statement, or perhaps a montage of family memories used as emotional leverage. He was wrong. What flickered onto the screen was far more sinister. It was a high-definition recording from inside the palace walls, taken just 48 hours prior. It showed the king in a moment of extreme vulnerability, slumped in his chair, weeping over the very notes he had taken during Harry's call. The angle was intimate, the audio crystal clear. It was a message without words. We are already inside. The king felt a cold sweat prickle at his hairline. This wasn't just a leak. It was an infiltration. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. Meghan Markle didn't need to guess how Charles was reacting to the final ban. She was watching it in real time. The scorched earth rebuttal was being fueled by a mole within the king's most trusted inner circle. As the video played, Charles saw himself through the eyes of his enemies. A broken, aging man, unable to control his household, let alone a nation. The psychological mastery of the Sussex camp was now undeniable. They weren't just fighting a war of words. They were conducting a surgical strike on the king's sanity. "Find them," Charles whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. "I want every phone, every tablet, every encrypted device in this building seized immediately." The palace, an institution built on the bedrock of loyalty and omerta, was suddenly transformed into a house of mirrors. Every footman, every lady-in-waiting, every high-level advisor became a suspect. The paranoia was palpable. If Meghan had the power to film the king in his private study, what else did she have? Did she have the medical records? Did she have the private conversations regarding the line of succession? The internal betrayal was the true final ban, a ban on the king's peace of mind. As the security team began the deep sweep of Clarence House, a junior tech flagged a suspicious outgoing data burst. It was traced back to a device assigned to a staffer who had been with Charles for over 15 years, someone who knew his favorite tea, his medical schedule, and his deepest insecurities. The betrayal cut deeper than any legal ultimatum. It proved that the Montecito camp had successfully turned the king's own staff into ghost agents, individuals who remained physically present, but whose loyalty had been bought or coerced by the promise of a life outside the royal machine. By 3 a.m., the king sat alone once more, but this time the lights were harsh and the curtains drawn tight. He realized that the S-file and the legal threats were secondary to the human rot within his own walls. Meghan Markle had successfully turned the palace into a prison of suspicion. The video ended with a single line of text overlaying the king's weeping face. "Tradition cannot protect you from the truth." The message was a direct challenge to the very foundation of the monarchy. Charles knew he couldn't just fight a legal battle anymore. To save the crown, he would have to hunt the viper in his own nest before the next video. The one that could end the monarchy forever was released to the world. The atmosphere within the ancient, stone-cold walls of Windsor Castle had shifted from traditional reverence to a state of absolute, high-tech paranoia. Following the discovery of the encrypted video showing King Charles in his most broken moment, Princess Anne, acting with the full, albeit trembling, authority of the sovereign, initiated what palace staff began to whisper about as the Great Purge. By 4 a.m., the usual rhythmic efficiency of the royal household was replaced by the clinical precision of MI5 vetted security teams. Every encrypted server, every private tablet, and every mobile device belonging to the king's inner circle was seized for deep forensic extraction. The message was clear. The monarchy was no longer just protecting its borders. It was hunting a viper in its own nest. As the digital forensics team peeled back the layers of encrypted metadata, they expected to find a disgruntled footman or a bribed secretary. Instead, they hit a digital wall that led directly to a high-level backdoor communication link, a link that didn't just point to Montecito, but to a secure, private residence within the royal estate itself. The king sat in the dimly lit command center, his eyes red from lack of sleep and the remnants of his earlier grief, as the lead investigator pointed to a series of intercepted signals. This wasn't a case of a staffer selling a story for a paycheck. This was a blood betrayal. The shockwave that hit Charles when the name of the ghost agent was finally revealed was more devastating than Meghan's final ban itself. It wasn't a member of the staff. It was a member of the royal family, someone who sat at the Christmas table, someone who shared the king's private jokes, and someone who had a front-row seat to the king's deteriorating health and emotional state. While the specific name remains under a strict Palace D notice for now, Insiders suggest it is a figure whose public image has always been one of neutrality and duty. This viper in the blood had been using a sophisticated, military-grade encryption app to feed Meghan Markle real-time psychological profiles of the king. They weren't just sending videos, they were sending vulnerability reports detailing exactly when Charles was most tired, which topics triggered his rage, and which memories of Prince Harry made him most susceptible to manipulation. Meghan's Montecito protocol was being fine-tuned by a traitor who knew the king's soul. The realization that his own family was helping Meghan build the final ban wall triggered a shift in Charles. The grieving father vanished, replaced by a monarch who realized that to save the institution, he might have to sacrifice the last of his family ties. The betrayal was ideological. The mole reportedly believed that the monarchy in its current form was obsolete, and that the Sussexes represented the only path to modern survival, even if it meant burning the current king to the ground to achieve it. As the sun began to rise over a fractured Windsor, Princess Anne made a chilling recommendation. The traitor must be erased from the official record. Charles was no longer just fighting a PR war against Meghan. He was now forced to conduct a silent, internal execution of a relative's status. The final ban had evolved. It was no longer just Meghan banning Charles from his grandchildren. It was now the king being forced to ban his own blood from his presence. The psychological walls were closing in. Just as the security teams moved to make an internal arrest, a final, taunting message appeared on the king's personal tablet, bypassing all new security protocols. It was a single image, a photo of the king's grandchildren, Archie and Lilibet, holding a book titled The Fall of the House. The war had just become personal in a way that tradition could never survive. The air in the private drawing room of Windsor Castle didn't just feel cold, it felt electrified with the static of a 1,000-year institution on the brink of collapse. King Charles remained in the shadows, his silhouette a haunting reminder of a father's broken heart, while Princess Anne, the sovereign's most loyal enforcer, stood under the harsh, clinical light of the chandelier. Across from her sat the viper in the blood, the royal family member whose digital trail had led directly to the gates of Meghan Markle's Montecito estate. The forensic evidence lay scattered on the mahogany table like the debris of a plane crash. Encrypted transcripts, time-stamped video leaks, and the vulnerability reports that had allowed Meghan to weaponize the king's own grief against him. You didn't just leak gossip. Anne's voice was a low, lethal whisper that cut through the silence more effectively than any shout. You provided the blueprints to my brother's soul. You told her exactly where to strike so that it would hurt most. The traitor, cornered and stripped of their royal veneer, didn't offer a plea for mercy. Instead, they offered a chilling justification that mirrored Meghan's own rhetoric, that the monarchy was a dying star, and that by feeding the Sussexes information, they were merely accelerating the inevitable to save the family from itself. It was an ideological betrayal that proved Meghan's influence had penetrated the very psychology of the House of Windsor. The tension reached its absolute zenith when the heavy doors burst open, admitting Prince William. The Prince of Wales did not look like a future king in that moment. He looked like a man who had reached his absolute limit. His cold fury was a physical presence in the room. Having been briefed on the digital breach, William's eyes were fixed on the traitor, with a look of such profound disappointment it was almost unbearable. He realized that while he had been mourning the loss of his brother, his own relatives were helping that brother and Meghan build a digital panopticon around his father. William's reaction was not one of sadness, but of total, unyielding exclusion. "You are no longer part of this story," he told the traitor, his voice vibrating with a resonance that suggested the transition of power had already begun in spirit. "The final ban that Meghan issued was only possible because of you. You gave them the keys to the castle, and in doing so, you have signed your own warrant of exile." The prince's intervention marked a turning point. He wasn't just defending his father, he was defending the future of his own children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, from the same Montecito protocol that had already claimed Archie and Lilibet. But the most terrifying revelation was yet to come. As the traitor was led away by the king's silent security detail, They turned to William and whispered 5 words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I'm not the only one." The room went deathly still. The Great Purge wasn't over. It had only just begun. Meghan Markle's network of ghost agents was deeper and more entrenched than even Princess Anne had feared. The king's tears had turned to stone, and as he looked at William, the father and son shared a silent, horrific realization. The crown was no longer a symbol of unity. It was a target in a war, where the enemy already shared their dinner table. The confession from the first traitor, "I'm not the only one," did not just echo through the drawing room. It acted as a psychological tectonic shift, fracturing the very foundation of Prince William's world. While the palace security teams scrambled to widen their digital net, a new and even more terrifying reality began to take shape. The final ban wasn't just a wall keeping the king away from his grandchildren in California. It was a cage being constructed around the Prince of Wales himself. As the forensic sweep moved into the private offices of Kensington Palace, the viper's nest was revealed to be far deeper than anyone had dared to imagine. The second blow landed with the clinical precision of a professional hit. Meghan Markle's legal team, operating through a series of blind intermediaries, informed the palace that they were in possession of the William tapes. These weren't just accidental recordings. They were high-fidelity audio files of Prince William's most private, unvarnished outbursts during the height of the Sussex exit. They captured the future king in moments of raw, unfiltered rage words spoken in the heat of a brotherly betrayal that, if released, would dismantle his image as the steady, stoic heir in a matter of seconds. William stood in the king's study, his face a mask of frozen fury as he realized the true extent of the infiltration. The second mole wasn't a distant relative or a disgruntled aide. The metadata suggested the recordings had been captured by someone with intimate, daily access to his private quarters. The paranoia that had paralyzed King Charles now claimed William. He began to look at his own staff, his own protection officers, even his own friends, through a lens of total suspicion. Meghan had successfully achieved the ultimate royal ban, a ban on trust. The threat was clear. If the palace proceeded with the 1,917 letters patent legal strike to strip titles, the William tapes would be released to global streaming platforms. Meghan was no longer just protecting her children. She was holding the future of the British monarchy's reputation for ransom. The final ban had evolved into a mutually assured destruction pact. The king, watching his son unravel, felt a new kind of grief. He realized that Meghan had not only taken his grandchildren, but was now successfully poisoning the legacy of his heir. In a moment of desperate clarity, William authorized a high-risk counterintelligence operation. He wasn't going to wait for the next leak. If there was a second mole, he would smoke them out using the very vulnerability reports they had been feeding to Montecito. But as the trap was set, a terrifying question lingered. What if the second mole wasn't working for money? What if they were working for a version of the future where the monarchy no longer existed? The Great Purge had reached the inner sanctum, and the echoes of William's own voice were now the weapons being used to silence the crown forever. The midnight air at Kensington Palace was thick with a toxic mixture of ozone from high-end surveillance equipment and the cold, metallic sweat of a man who no longer knew whom to trust. Prince William, the Prince of Wales, stood in the center of his darkened private office, his silhouette illuminated only by the rhythmic blinking of a forensic data intercept monitor. He was no longer waiting for a leak. He was baiting a trap. Following the chilling warning from the first traitor, "I'm not the only one," William had orchestrated a masterful piece of counter-espionage. He had planted a ghost document, a fabricated report detailing a secret plan to restore Prince Archie's HRH titles on a secure internal server, accessible only to a select group of his most trusted inner circle. The trap was sprung with a speed that was as impressive as it was heartbreaking. Less than 45 minutes after the document was shared, the specific phrasing coded with unique digital markers appeared in an encrypted inquiry from a high-level Montecito-linked legal firm. The digital trail didn't lead back to a distant relative or a disgruntled footman. It led directly to the personal, black site communication device of William's own private secretary, a man who had been the prince's shadow for a decade, the man who held the keys to his schedule, his secrets, and the very recordings known as the William tapes. The confrontation that followed was devoid of the shouting matches of the past. It was a clinical, icy execution of a decade-long friendship. As the security detail entered the room, the secretary didn't look for an exit. Instead, he looked at William with a defiant, almost messianic clarity. The second mole wasn't working for Meghan's money. He was working for her philosophy. He confessed that he had been recording William's outbursts not to destroy him, but to curate a record of the truth for a post-monarchy world. He viewed Meghan Markle not as a villain, but as a necessary disruptor, and himself as the architect of a peaceful transition that involved the systematic dismantling of the heir's reputation. William felt the room tilt. The final ban was no longer just about his father's grief or the distance between brothers. It was a total institutional infection. Meghan Markle had successfully turned the very people paid to protect the future of the crown into its most lethal observers. The William tapes weren't just leverage. They were the final nails in the coffin of royal privacy. As the secretary was stripped of his credentials and escorted into the night, he left William with a final, devastating blow. You think the tapes are the end? Meghan doesn't just have your voice, William. She has the videos from the 2021 Sandringham Summit. She has everything. The Prince of Wales stood alone in the silence of Kensington Palace, realizing that the Great Purge had failed to stop the bleeding. The Montecito camp didn't just have spies. They had a time capsule of the monarchy's most shameful moments, ready to be detonated the moment the king moved to enforce the 1,917 letters patent. The final ban was now a total stalemate. To save the crown, William realized he would have to do the unthinkable. He would have to fly to California, not as a prince, but as a man prepared to bargain with the woman who held the detonator to his family's legacy. Under the pale gold sunset, draping over the palm-lined ridges of Montecito, California, a sleek black SUV quietly pulled into the gates of the Sussex estate. There were no flashing paparazzi bulbs, no grand police escorts. Inside sat Prince William, the future King of England, a man who had flown halfway across the globe to confront the woman holding the detonator to his family's legacy. This was not a family visit. It was a high-stakes political negotiation where the crown itself was being weighed against its darkest secrets. As William stepped into the opulent living room, he found Meghan Markle waiting. She showed no hint of intimidation or fear in the presence of the powerful heir. Instead, Meghan radiated a cold confidence, the aura of someone who knew they held the winning hand. Harry sat nearby, silent and gaunt, a shadow of his former self, torn between his bloodline and the protection of his nuclear family. The air was so thick with tension that it felt as if a single sharp breath could shatter the entire room. William opened the conversation with an icy tone, demanding the immediate surrender of the Sandringham tapes and the permanent deletion of the vulnerability reports provided by the palace traitors. In exchange, the monarchy would halt the execution of the nuclear option, the legal amendment to the 1,917 letters patent that would strip Archie and Lilibet of their titles and inheritance rights forever. It was a cold trade, honor for survival. William emphasized that if these secrets were leaked, no one would be safe. Not the king, not the heirs, and certainly not the Sussex children. However, Meghan only smiled a smile that never reached her eyes. She stood up, walked toward the window overlooking the Pacific, and delivered a response that left William paralyzed. She revealed that the final ban was never an act of retaliation. It was an act of liberation. Meghan asserted that she no longer cared for hollow titles or the crumbling stone walls of London. What she demanded was a permanent, absolute silence from the palace regarding her life in America. "You think the crown is the most precious thing in the world," Meghan said, her voice low but echoing in the absolute stillness of the room. "But to me and my children, it is nothing more than a gilded cage. You came here to protect a crown, William. I am here to protect my truth." The climax of the confrontation occurred when William attempted to remind her of her duty to their ancestors. Meghan cut him off with the final line, a sentence that palace aides would later claim ended any hope of reconciliation for all eternity. Meghan looked the future king dead in the eye and declared, "The crown is just a ghost story, William. I'm the only one who has stopped believing in it. My final ban is this: my children will never look back, and you will never be able to reach us again." William left Montecito in absolute silence. His flight back to London carried the bitter weight of a devastating truth. The House of Windsor might have preserved its secrets through a humiliating shadow agreement, but they had permanently lost a piece of their own bloodline. King Charles, upon receiving the report from his son, did not cry anymore. He sat alone in the dim light of Windsor Castle, realizing that the monarchy he inherited was entering a new, fractured era, one where power could no longer overcome the fierce, defiant withdrawal of a mother. The curtain had closed on the final ban drama, but its aftershocks would shake Buckingham Palace for decades to come. The silence from Montecito was not peace. It was a permanent, irreversible severance.